Okay. Book 10 can be the primary focus. Not a lot goes on in Book 10. The main points of Book 10 are Socrates' argument for the immortality of the soul, the immortality of the psyche. Once again, soul here, don't get hung up, it's not religious. It means it's better translated as mind. It's the inanimate thing that makes us us. And then we have the myth of I will focus primarily on the immortality of the soul, but to do all this, we first need to back up to some of the central concepts of the Republic. The first thing I want to discuss or review is the tripartite division of the psyche. This is going to tie directly into when we talk about its immortality and how this is supposed to translate over to the polis or the city. So if you recall, the psyche Socrates proposes is composed of three parts. We have logos or reason, we have thumos or desire, and then we have epi or thumos is spirit, and then we have epithumia, which is desire. So reason, spirit, and desire. These translate over to our guardians in the case of logos, our auxiliaries, in the case of spirit, and our craftspeople in the case of desire, or epithumia. The guardians or logos has its characteristic virtue of Sophia or wisdom. Our auxiliaries have the characteristic virtue of Andrea or courage. The craftspeople do not have a characteristic virtue, but when everything is structured well, both in the city and in the polis, when all the parts are as they should be and the composing parts recognize the goodness of the structure, we get our supervening virtues of sophrosune, or temperance, and dikaiosune, or justice. Dikaiosune, justice, being the task of Book 1 to find out what this is, and Socrates articulates justice as the proper structuring. So the structure here being logos in charge, working in conjunction with spirit to control appetite. Socrates, in many ways, like Aristotle, thinks that emotions are natural parts of human life. There is no virtue or vice attached to emotion. These are just things that humans experience. The axiological, the valuing, the normativity of emotions gets tied into what we do with them. Are we led by them? Are we led by our desires? Or do we know how to use them appropriately and keep them in check? Sophrosune, or temperance, here is the supervening virtue. Then not only is it structured well, that the soul or the polis is structured in the way that it ought to be, but that in the case of the polis, the citizens want it to be structured this way, and in the case of the psyche, that the agent wants it to be structured this way. So it's not enough, in many ways we're seeing a similarity here between Plato and Aristotle, it's not enough that you have the appropriate structure, but you have to want it as well. Okay? It's only when this all happens that we get our four virtues. In the medieval period, with the syncretism of the early church with Platonic thought, you're going to see these referred to as cardinal virtues. And then over time, they get incorporated into the church to a greater degree, and they become kind of these Western Christian virtues. But they really have their grounding here in Plato. as does a lot of the practices, at least, of the Western Church. A lot of Christianity is exposed to syncretism with Hellenic thought, probably for the worse. So this is our tripartite division of the soul and how it describes over to the polis. From here, let's review the divided line. This is perhaps one of the most central analogies of the entire dialogue. And here we have our epistemic states. So that is the degrees of knowing that one can be in as it relates to ontological status. That is the degree to which something is real, or it's how fundamental it is to the order of things. At our least secure status, we have imagination. And the Greek here is akasia. And it relates directly to the ontological state of images. Or in the Greek, eidos. Okay? This is the least secure state that one can be in. The reason it's the least secure state is because the epistemic state is fully dependent upon the ontological state of the object, or the ontological status of the object. Images are the least fundamental, the least real kinds of things in Plato's division of ontology. And as a result, we can never be secure about them. We can only have a very it can only be in a very fluid epistemic state as it regards images. So think of it practically. You see, imagine little children doing hand shadows or hand puppets with shadows, or even trying to find images in the clouds. You don't know that this image is of a bunny, but you can imagine that the hand puppet that the child does with the light is, it looks like a rabbit. These images they're real in the sense that yes, they are visually perceptible, but there's no rabbit in the hand shadow. There just is the very vague semblance of a rabbit. Same thing with finding images in clouds. You don't see the dog in the clouds. You see clouds that, if you squint and turn your head just right, very vaguely, maybe kind of on the right day, look like a dog. This is what Plato has in mind here. Above this, we have the epistemic state of belief, or in the Greek, doxa. And it relates to the ontological status of physical things. We don't talk this way, but nevertheless the idea still tracks. I have a certain set of beliefs. We would be very loose in our language and say, for example, I know that this marker is green. I know that this desk is in front of me. I know that the marker cap is in my pocket. We use the word know very loosely in English. But what Plato is trying to articulate here is I don't have knowledge of these things. Rather, I have beliefs. The reason I can't have knowledge is because knowledge, we'll get to this in a little bit, but this word episteme in the Hellenic mind is not subject to change. Knowledge cannot change. However, beliefs can change. And my knowledge or my belief that I'm holding the marker is subject to change. Why? Because I can put the marker down. And now I'm no longer holding the marker. I can take the marker cap out of my pocket, and it's no longer in my pocket. So the most that I can have is beliefs regarding physical things. Why? Because physical things, by their very nature, are subject to change. We see the same thing in Aristotle. We see that Aristotle divides the fields of scholarly inquiry into substances and non-substances, and then mutable and immutable. So this is Aristotle here, but nevertheless we see the similar concept in Plato. So we have our fields of inquiry for Aristotle. And we have things that are toon, or substances, things that are me toon, things that are not substances. Then we have things that can change and things that cannot change. Things that are substances or fields that study changing substances. This is biology at its finest. Biology studies real things, but it studies natural things. And nature, as we've read in the physics, by definition, nature changes. Things that are not, things that are not substances, but nevertheless are subject to change, are things like ethics. So when we read the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle thinks that every claim that he makes in there is a really good rule of thumb, but it doesn't amount to the realm of knowledge. It's still doxa, it's belief. Why? Because ethics, economics, political relations, those are all predicated on humans and human activity. Humans change. And because humans change, those domains are subject to change as well. I think Aristotle is a little bit wiser to realize that he probably could not give a contemporary reader economic advice. Why? Because economics have changed over the past, 2,300 years. Not subject to change, that is toon. This is metaphysics, or perhaps more appropriately put is theology, he thinks, and this is our empty spot. Okay, but we see, so that's a brief tangent into Aristotle, but we see the same exact idea here in Plato. One can only be in a state of belief as it regards physical things because these things are mutable. These two combined, our images and physical things, make up the sensory world, or the sensual things. That is, things that are perceptible by the senses. And Plato thinks that these are categorically inferior to the things that come above it. So do not be confused at all. Even though Plato is fleshing out his ontology, related to Plato's ontology is most certainly his axiology. That is, his theory of value. Not only does he think that images are less real than physical things, than mathematical things, than the forms, he thinks they are just inferior. Okay? So even though he paints it as a study of ontology, it most certainly is a claim on axiology as well. Okay. Above this, the epistemic state that we are in is, I will call it discursive reasoning. I have probably called this several things over the lectures. And it's because this word that he uses, dianoia, is a little hard to translate. It is a compound word, which, like German, Greek uses compound words. It's composed of the preposition dia, which means through, like go through the tunnel, and the related noun nous, which means mind. Here it's noia, and it's a thinking through. It's the ability to reason in a deductive fashion, and this is related to mathematical objects. So we get an interesting theory here on mathematics from Plato. He doesn't spend much time on it at all, but nevertheless it is there. So consider the arithmetic proposition, 1 plus 1 is equal to 2. In our contemporary understanding, we don't understand these figures, these Arabic numerals, as picking out anything real. In the world, we very much think of it in the same way Aristotle does, where for Aristotle, numbers are abstraction in the genus of quantity. And we can use as many instances of the number one, as many instantiations as our little hearts desire to do whatever equations we need to do. This is why when you're teaching a child multiplication for the first time, you will use addition to do it. You will set things in sets and multiply and add the sets by the sets. And we understand, or we at least postulate, that these don't pick up anything real in the world. This is not the Platonic position. Plato very much thinks that mathematicals are real objects. They are things that exist in the world, and they are related to the most real kind of thing that Plato calls the forms, or toedos. If we did the plur in the and the epistemic state that we are with regard to the forms is that of knowledge, or as we've been seeing, episteme. Unlike doxa, episteme cannot change. And as a result, we can only ever have it for the forms. So when we think of, for example, oneness, Plato is going to think that everything that is one, whether it be the Arabic numeral one, whether it be a physical thing, so like one stick, or an image, so for example, one shadow of a stick, all of these going down the divided line as far as ontological status, all three of these objects have a share in oneness. Okay? This is what Plato calls participation. That's how it gets translated. Things lower down the divided line, they are in a participation relationship with the form. The word here that he uses, I put the word just because I think it's valuable and it helps flesh out this relationship to a greater degree, is the verb, the infinitive, is metalambane. This is a compound verb again. Meta is our preposition that means with, and lambane is our infinitive, which means to grasp or to take hold of. So metalambane quite literally means to physically take hold of. So these Arabic numeral one, a single stick or a shadow of a stick, are getting their oneness from the form of oneness, or as Plato calls it in another dialogue, tohen, or the one. And they're taking hold of, they're grasping onto this concept. Much later in Platonic dialogues, Plato will understand these forms in the case of language. You'll understand them linguistically as definitions. So what it is to be unity, or what it is to be oneness, tohen, is to not be subject to division. The number one is indivisible. I cannot divide the number one by anything. This is what makes it the number one. And you can contrast oneness from two-ness, or we may just say duality. We can contrast these two, and we understand that this Arabic numeral 1 and this Arabic numeral 2, or the concept of oneness and the concept of two-ness, differ because we understand the totienena, that what it is to be oneness versus duality. What it is to be one is to not be subject to division. What it is to be two is to be subject to division, but only to be subject to division once. Okay? So this is the way Plato is thinking about the world. He's thinking that even though what we engage with most of the time are physical things, these physical things only get their intelligibility because of their participation in the forms. He thinks that when we study and when we do better for ourselves, we start thinking about mathematicals. However, it is the guardians that study these things. The guardians study the forms. And this is what makes the guardians the appropriate group to lead. This is why they have wisdom. Sophia, for Plato, is knowledge of the forms. Okay? It is due to this knowledge, this, once again, episteme, is due to this unchanging epistemic state that the guardians are in, that they are able to, in the case of the suke, in the case of the soul, lead the soul appropriately. They're able to make decisions for the mind appropriately. And in the case of the polis, that they are able to lead the polis. Now we've talked that in the Hellenic model, the role of statescraft in the Hellenic model is to bring about the eudaimonia of the citizens. So in the same way that horse breeding is the goal of horse breeding, telos of horse breeding is to build or breed a racehorse. The telos of statescraft is to build or develop a flourishing citizen group. Okay, so it's outward focused, not focused on the individual. Okay, so this is a recap here of the divided line and the way Plato is thinking about states of knowledge or epistemic states that we're in, the way he's thinking about the construction of the world and valuing. The last thing that'll then tie into the immortality of the soul argument is the different kinds of people and the different kinds of constitutions. Okay. So, like the suke and the polis, there's a one-to-one correlation here with our best kind of constitution being an aristocracy. Once again, don't have like a flinch reaction and think of 18th century Western European aristocracies. Those are really oligarchies. An aristocracy, he literally means the rule of the best. And the corresponding individual is the philosopher king. Once again, don't get hung up on the gender. Greek is a gendered language, but like we saw much earlier, Plato thinks there's, aside from physical strength, which he doesn't place much value on, there's no difference between men and women. So philosopher queens is fine too. Underneath aristocracy is a timocracy. This is where thumos leads the spirit, or leads the suke, and the correlating person here is the timocrat. Not a word we use at all. Underneath this is the oligarch. An oligarchy, we would say, and the corresponding person is an oligarch. The oligarchy resembles the aristocracy in that it's relatively few people in charge. The difference here is whereas the aristocracy has the philosopher kings in charge or logos in charge, the oligarchy doesn't necessarily have the guardians in charge. It has someone else, even though there's few of them. Underneath this, we have democracy. The correlating person here being the Democrat. Don't think contemporary U.S. Politics here. Rather, maybe think of a libertine. And recall Plato's criticisms of democracy and of the libertine. They're a person without order. And then democracies, Plato thinks, will always devolve into tyranny. And the correlating person here being the tyrant. things to bear in mind here is that the tyrant is marked by phobos, or fear, because the tyrant is led by epithumia. She is led by her desires, and because of this, she experiences constant fear. Now, she may not perceive it as fear, but nevertheless, it's fear. Think of this like the junkie or the drunkard. They're constantly thinking about where they're going to get their next hit, or where they're going to get their next drink, and if they're going to be able to do that. Okay? We don't think of that as fear. We perhaps maybe better understand this in the way that Epicurus will understand this, as ataraxia, or how we translate it as anxiety. But this is the same idea that Plato is trying to capture. The thought that, look, when you were led by your desires, you're going to have an anxious life. You're going to have an anxious life because you are constantly fixated on satisfaction of desire. And sometimes you can't satisfy your desires. Whereas the philosopher king or philosopher queen is marked by hedone, is marked by pleasure. Now, the pleasure that she experiences is what we can call genuine pleasure. That is, it's a pleasure not predicated upon a lack. So, for example, it feels good to drink water when you're thirsty. There's pleasure associated with that. It feels good to eat when you're hungry. There's pleasure associated with that. But those, Plato thinks, are inferior kinds of pleasures because you only experience the pleasure of that's associated with drinking water when you're thirsty if you were first thirsty. So in order to experience this pleasure, there must first be the relevant deficiency. But what Plato is thinking of here, the kind of pleasure that marks our philosopher kings and queens, is pleasure that is not predicated upon any kind of deficiency. Rather, it is being pleased that. It's a mental state. So we may think about the mental state of being pleased that you have finally grasped the mathematical concept. I've argued before in papers that even genuine pleasure is predicated upon a lack, and that all Platonic pleasure, as we see later on in the Philebus, is predicated upon deficiency. But that's neither here nor there. The reason we discuss all this is to get to the argument for the immortality of the soul. The immortality of the psyche. It's a fairly simple argument. The first claim is vice is the only thing that can destroy an object. So think about rust. Rust, in a very loose sense, is the vice of metal, and as such, it's the thing that can destroy metal. Every object, Plato's going to think, has its own relevant vice. In the case of metal, it's very obvious. Our second claim here is that tyranny is the vice of the psyche. We get this claim based on our models of appropriate constitutions and appropriate ordering of the psyche. So tyranny is the vice of the psyche. The reason this is because tyranny is a flipped order. Instead of logos being in charge using thumos to control epithumia, we have epithumia in charge using thumos, using spirit, to stifle logos. It's an inverted ordering of what the proper soul looks like. Then we get a claim, but tyrants don't just drop dead. Tyrants don't die from their tyranny. Now, Socrates is not thinking here, or Plato is not thinking about tyrants that get themselves killed by a constituency because of their tyrannical behavior. He's thinking, look, when you suddenly become a tyrant in soul, whether or not you have anyone you can be a tyrant over, but when you become a tyrant in soul, that is epithumia using thumos, disciple, logos, you don't just suddenly drop dead, right? You may be living a terrible life, Socrates thinks, but you're not going to just drop dead. So as a result, the soul is immortal. Why? Because if we agree to 1, that only the relevant vice of a thing can destroy an object, and then we see in 3 that the relevant vice doesn't destroy the object, namely tyranny does not destroy a suke, then the soul must be immortal. Now this word immortal here in the Greek is athanatos. The alpha here is called an alpha privative. It's like our English un or in, it negates a noun or an adjective. Thanatos is the word for death. So this word here, athanatos, is perhaps most literally translated as deathless. And there's different ways we can understand this. It becomes problematic for understanding what this claim of the immortality of the soul is really supposed to amount to. So take 2 examples. Take Achilles, the classical figure and demigod. Achilles is athanatos in the sense that Achilles will never die of natural causes. However, Achilles is killable. You shoot him in the heel, he dies. Contrast this to the god of Abraham, who is understood to be athanatos in the sense that he is unkillable and immortal. There is no, not only will the God of Abraham not die, but there is no killing the God of Abraham, unlike Achilles, who, even though he won't die of his own, can be killed. Okay? So it's not clear here what Plato exactly means when he says that the suke is athanatos. Does this mean that the suke cannot die on its own? Or does he mean that the suke is like the God of Abraham, and that the suke just can never die nor be destroyed at all? It's not clear. The last thing we end up with in Book 10 is the myth of I am not going to spend much time on the myth of read it on your own. What I will say about the myth of is it's very interesting here that Plato makes this claim that poets need to be removed from the Callipolis. Get them out. The reason we need to get them out, I don't have my divided line anymore, is because poetry, by its very nature, deals in images. The poet has no knowledge, so claims Plato. Rather, the poet feigns knowledge about all different kinds of things. The poet, by their very craft, deals in images, and as such, they're more harm than good. Plato does not think there is a craft that is poetry on its own. Rather, poets are imitators of real things. So Plato says that we need to get rid of them from the Callipolis. But we see throughout the Republic, and in fact Plato ends the Republic with, ostensibly, poetry. He ends it with a myth. Okay? This word myth here is the Greek word muthos, which muthos literally means a story. We think of myths as necessarily being false, but that's not what a muthos is. Muthoi, myths, are just stories. Well, that's what poets do. They tell us stories. It's interesting that Plato, who thinks that poets and poetry are dangerous and don't have a place in the Callipolis, ends the entire Politeia, ends the Republic with a story. And he incorporates stories starting all the way back in Book 3 with the Noble Lie. Poetry, or muthoi, have played an integral role throughout the entirety of the text. But yet Plato is so harsh on the poet. And unlike Aristotle, who we have mildly polished lecture notes, with the exception of the Nicomachean Ethics, with Plato, we have refined and edited works. These are fully fleshed out dialogues. They're pieces of literature. They're not just lecture notes like Aristotle. So we have this overarching theme here of the danger of poetry, yet Plato's blatant and intentional use of poetry. I'll let you think about that on your own, though. That sums up Book 10, and that kind of caps the Republic. Your final paper is due on the date of the syllabus. I cannot make extensions, otherwise I can't grade it in time. And that's all.